The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Rosewood Palace as Princess Elena walked through the grand corridors, her heels clicking softly against the polished stone. She carried herself with the practiced grace that came from years of royal training, but today there was a tension in her shoulders that even her perfect posture couldn't hide. Elena had always known that marrying Prince Alexander would mean navigating the complex waters of royal politics, but she hadn't anticipated how treacherous those waters could become. As the mother of young Prince Louis, she had hoped that her position as the future queen would afford her some protection from the more vindictive members of the royal household. She had been wrong. The trouble had started 3 months ago when Queen Mother Isabel, Alexander's stepmother, had returned from her extended stay in the Mediterranean. Isabel had married the late King Edmund when Alexander was already a teenager, making her technically Louis's step-grandmother, though the relationship had always been strained. Where Elena believed in a more modern approach to raising the young prince, Isabel clung to the rigid traditions of the old monarchy. Elena paused outside the breakfast room, hearing the familiar sound of her 5-year-old son's laughter echoing through the partially open door. Louis was seated at the small table that had been specially made for him, his tutor Mrs. Whitmore helping him with his morning lessons. His dark hair, so much like his father's, fell across his forehead as he concentrated on writing his letters. "Mama!" Louis called out when he spotted her, his face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that made all the palace intrigue seem suddenly insignificant. Elena's heart swelled as she moved toward him, but before she could reach her son, another voice cut through the room. "Your Highness." The formal address came from Commander James Rothwell, the head of the Royal Guard. He stood at attention near the window, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the breakfast table. Though James had served the royal family faithfully for over a decade, Elena had always sensed there was more to him than met the eye. "Commander," Elena acknowledged with a nod, then turned her attention back to Louis. "How are your lessons going, sweetheart?" Before Louis could answer, the breakfast room door opened again, and Queen Mother Isabel entered with her characteristic dramatic flair. At 62, Isabel remained a striking woman, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her emerald dress chosen to complement the family jewels she wore even at breakfast. But it was the cold calculation in her blue eyes that always made Elena's skin crawl. "Elena, dear," Isabel said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How lovely to find you here. I was just coming to collect Louis for his etiquette lesson with Professor Hartwell." Elena felt her jaw tighten. They had discussed this already. Louis has his regular lessons with Mrs. Whitmore until 10 o'clock. Professor Hartwell's sessions are scheduled for the afternoon. Isabel's smile never wavered, but Elena caught the flash of irritation in her eyes. "I'm afraid there's been a change in schedule. Professor Hartwell has a conflicting engagement this afternoon, so we'll need to adjust accordingly." This was typical of Isabel's tactics, making unilateral decisions about Louis's schedule and presenting them as unavoidable facts. Elena had learned to recognize these power plays, but that didn't make them any easier to counter without causing a scene in front of her son. "Perhaps we could discuss this later," Elena suggested diplomatically. "After Louis finishes his current lesson." But Isabel was already moving toward the little prince, her jeweled hands reaching out to him. "Come along, Louis. We mustn't keep the professor waiting." Louis looked confused, glancing between his mother and step-grandmother. At 5 years old, he was already beginning to sense the undercurrents of tension that surrounded him, though he was far too young to understand their implications. Elena stepped forward instinctively, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "Louis stays here until his scheduled lesson is finished." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Isabel's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing the steel beneath. "I hardly think you're in a position to dictate the prince's education, my dear. After all, you're not yet queen." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Elena felt her cheeks flush, but before she could respond, Commander Rothwell stepped forward. "Your Majesty, Your Highness," he said formally, addressing both women. "Perhaps I might suggest that Prince Louis's current lesson schedule be maintained as originally planned. Any changes could be discussed through the proper channels." Elena was surprised by the intervention. While the commander's words were carefully neutral, his presence at her side felt like support. Isabel, however, looked furious at the interference. "Commander Rothwell," she said icily, "I wasn't aware that the Royal Guard had taken over responsibility for the prince's education." James didn't flinch under her withering stare. "My responsibility is to ensure the safety and security of all members of the royal family, Your Majesty. That includes maintaining stability in the young prince's routine." It was a clever response, Elena realized. By framing his intervention in terms of security rather than taking sides in the dispute, Commander Rothwell had managed to support her position without technically overstepping his bounds. Isabel clearly understood the game being played as well. Her eyes narrowed as she looked between Elena and the commander, and Elena wondered if the older woman suspected something more than professional courtesy in James's defense of her position. The truth was, Elena wasn't entirely sure herself. Over the past few months, as Isabel's interference in Louis's upbringing had increased, Commander Rothwell had found subtle ways to support Elena's authority. Nothing that could be called improper, but enough to make Isabel suspicious and Elena grateful. "Very well," Isabel said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. "But this discussion is far from over, Elena. There are protocols to be observed, traditions to be maintained. The prince's education cannot be left to modern whims." With that parting shot, she swept from the room, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence broken only by Louis's quiet voice. "Mama, why is Grandmother Isabel angry?" Elena knelt down to her son's level, smoothing his hair with gentle fingers. "She's not angry, sweetheart. She just has different ideas about how things should be done." Louis nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the resilience of a child who had grown accustomed to the strange dynamics of palace life. "Can I finish my letters now?" "Of course, darling." Elena kissed his forehead and stood, noticing that Commander Rothwell was still standing nearby, his attention seemingly focused on the garden beyond the window. Mrs. Whitmore, who had remained diplomatically silent during the confrontation, resumed the lesson with professional efficiency. Elena watched for a few minutes, taking comfort in the normalcy of her son's concentration as he carefully formed each letter. "Your Highness," Commander Rothwell said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "Might I have a word?" Elena glanced at Louis, who was completely absorbed in his work, then nodded. They moved to the far end of the room, near the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. "Thank you," Elena said simply. "For what you did back there." James's expression remained carefully neutral, but she caught something in his dark eyes that made her pulse quicken. "It was nothing more than my duty, Your Highness." Was it? The question slipped out before Elena could stop herself. She had been wondering about Commander Rothwell's motivations for weeks now, about the way he seemed to anticipate her needs and appear whenever Isabel created difficulties. For a moment, his professional mask slipped, and Elena saw something raw and honest in his face. But, almost immediately, he recovered his composure. "Your Highness, if I may be frank, I've served this family for many years. I've seen how palace politics can affect everyone, including the younger members of the family. Prince Louis deserves stability and protection from adult conflicts." It was a diplomatic answer, but Elena sensed there was more he wanted to say. Before either of them could speak further, however, the breakfast room door opened again, and Prince Alexander entered. Elena's husband looked tired, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. As the heir to the throne, Alexander carried an enormous burden of responsibility, and, lately, the weight of it seemed to be wearing him down. The ongoing tensions with his stepmother weren't helping matters. "Good morning," Alexander said, kissing Elena's cheek before ruffling Louis's hair. "How are the lessons going, my boy?" "I'm writing about knights, Papa," Louis announced proudly, holding up his paper to show the careful letters spelling out words like brave and honor. Alexander smiled, the first genuine expression Elena had seen from him all morning. "Excellent work. Knights are very important, you know. They protect people who can't protect themselves." Elena noticed Commander Rothwell's slight reaction to these words, a subtle straightening of his posture that suggested the comment had struck home. "Alexander," Elena said carefully, "your stepmother stopped by earlier. She wanted to change Louis's schedule for today." Alexander's expression darkened. Again? We've discussed this. Lewis's routine is not to be altered without consulting both of us. I explained that to her, Elena said. Commander Rothwell supported the existing schedule. Alexander turned to look at the commander with what Elena thought might be gratitude. Thank you, James. I appreciate your attention to these matters. Of course, Your Highness. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elena's lady-in-waiting, Lady Margaret, who entered with an apologetic expression. Your Highness, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Queen Mother Isabel has requested your presence in the blue drawing room. She says it's urgent. Elena felt her heart sink. Whatever Isabel wanted to discuss, it couldn't be good. The blue drawing room was traditionally used for formal audiences and difficult conversations. I'll be right there, Elena said, then turned to Alexander. Will you stay with Lewis? Actually, Alexander said reluctantly, I have a meeting with the Foreign Secretary in 15 minutes. But Lewis will be fine here with Mrs. Whitmore. Elena hesitated. Leaving Lewis alone, even with his tutor, felt wrong after the morning's confrontation with Isabel. But she couldn't very well refuse a direct summons from the Queen Mother. If I may, Commander Rothwell interjected quietly, I was planning to review the security protocols for this wing of the palace. I could remain nearby while Prince Louis finishes his lesson. Elena felt a rush of relief and, something else, a warmth that she quickly pushed aside. That would be very helpful, Commander. Thank you. As Elena prepared to leave for what would undoubtedly be an unpleasant encounter with Isabel, she felt reassured knowing that James would be watching over Louis. But she also realized that her growing reliance on the commander's support was becoming dangerous, not just politically, but personally. The palace corridors seemed longer than usual as Elena made her way to the blue drawing room, her mind racing with possibilities about what Isabel might want to discuss. Whatever it was, Elena was certain it would have to do with Louis and her authority as his mother. She paused outside the ornate doors, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Inside that room waited a confrontation that could change everything, not just for her, but for Louis and the future of the monarchy itself. Elena straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and prepared to face whatever scheme Isabel had devised this time. The blue drawing room lived up to its name, with walls covered in rich azure silk and furniture upholstered in complementary shades of navy and gold. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting intricate patterns across the Persian carpet where Queen Mother Isabel stood with her back to the door, apparently admiring a portrait of King Edmund. You wanted to see me, Elena said, keeping her voice level as she entered the room. Isabel turned slowly, her expression unreadable. Yes, dear. Please, have a seat. She gestured toward one of the ornate chairs arranged near the fireplace. We have much to discuss. Elena remained standing. If this is about Louis's schedule again, I thought we had resolved that matter. Resolved? Isabel's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. My dear Elena, nothing has been resolved. In fact, I think we need to have a very frank conversation about boundaries and authority within this household. The words carried an unmistakable threat. Elena finally took a seat, not out of deference but because she sensed this confrontation would require all her strength and composure. Isabel settled into the chair opposite her, arranging her emerald skirts with practiced elegance. You know, when I married Edmund, I understood that my role would be complex. I was not Alexander's mother, but I was the queen. I had responsibilities, not just privileges. And now you're the Queen Mother, Elena replied carefully. Your role has evolved. Indeed it has. But my concern for this family's reputation and traditions has not diminished. Isabel leaned forward slightly. Which brings me to the matter of young Louis and his education. Elena felt her temper beginning to rise, but she forced herself to remain calm. Louis's education is proceeding excellently under his current tutors. His progress reports are outstanding. Academic progress is not my only concern, Isabel said dismissively. The boy needs to understand his position, his responsibilities. He needs proper guidance about royal protocol and behavior. He's 5 years old, Isabel. He has plenty of time to learn protocol. Does he? Isabel's voice sharpened. Because from what I've observed, he's being raised more like a commoner's child than a future king. This casual attitude toward tradition, this modern approach you insist upon, it's not suitable for a prince. Elena's hands clenched in her lap. Louis is a happy, healthy child who knows he's loved. I won't apologize for that. Love is not the issue, Isabel said coldly. Preparation for duty is. And, I'm afraid your sentimental approach is doing the boy a disservice. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Elena's lady-in-waiting, Lady Margaret, peered around the doorframe. Forgive me, Your Majesty, Your Highness, but there's been a small incident. Prince Louis seems to have wandered off during his lesson break. Elena shot to her feet, her heart racing. What do you mean, wandered off? Mrs. Whitmore stepped out for just a moment to retrieve some materials from the library. When she returned, the prince was gone. The palace staff is searching for him now. Terror gripped Elena's chest. Louis was curious and fearless, qualities that served him well in the protected environment of his usual routines but could be dangerous in a palace full of hidden passages and potential hazards. Where is Commander Rothwell? Elena demanded, already moving toward the door. He's coordinating the search, Your Highness. He asked me to inform you immediately. Elena pushed past Lady Margaret and hurried toward the door, but Isabel's voice stopped her. Elena, wait. She turned to find Isabel standing as well, but the older woman's expression had changed. The calculated coldness had been replaced by something that looked almost like genuine concern. This is exactly what I was trying to tell you, Isabel said quietly. The boy has too much freedom. If he were properly supervised, following the protocols I've been suggesting, this wouldn't have happened. Elena felt as though she'd been slapped. Are you actually suggesting that this is my fault? I'm suggesting that perhaps it's time to reconsider your approach to his upbringing. The implication hung in the air between them. Elena realized that this moment was about much more than Louis's temporary disappearance. Isabel was using the crisis to make a larger point about authority and control within the royal household. We can discuss parenting philosophies after my son is found, Elena said coldly, then left the room without waiting for Isabel's response. The palace corridors buzzed with activity as staff members searched every room, every alcove, every possible hiding place where a 5-year-old boy might have gone. Elena felt her panic rising with each passing minute. Louis was adventurous but not reckless. He wouldn't have left the safety of the family quarters without a good reason. She found Commander Rothwell in the main hallway, directing the search with calm efficiency. His usual composure seemed slightly strained, and Elena realized that he was probably feeling responsible for Louis's disappearance. Any sign of him? Elena asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Not yet, Your Highness. But we've covered most of the main areas. I have teams checking the gardens and the lower levels now. Elena nodded, then had a sudden thought. What about the old nursery? The one in the East Wing? James looked puzzled. I wasn't aware the prince knew about that room. Alexander showed it to him last month. It's where Alexander played when he was Louis's age. Louis was fascinated by all the old toys and books. Without hesitation, Commander Rothwell turned to one of his officers. Check the East Wing nursery immediately. As they waited for word from the search team, Elena found herself studying James's profile. Even in crisis, he maintained his professional bearing, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands remained clenched at his sides. This isn't your fault, she said quietly. He turned to look at her, and, for a moment, his careful mask slipped entirely. I should have stayed closer. I should have anticipated that he might wander off. He's never done this before. There was no reason to think. There's every reason, James interrupted, his voice low but intense. You heard Queen Mother Isabel this morning. She's been trying to undermine your authority over Prince Louis for months. Today's incident with the schedule change was just the latest example. Elena was startled by the vehemence in his voice. You think this has something to do with Isabel? I think the palace has become an unsafe environment for the prince in ways that have nothing to do with physical security. Before Elena could respond to this extraordinary statement, one of the guards came running down the corridor. "Commander! We found him." East Wing Nursery, just as Her Highness suggested. Relief flooded through Elena so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. James's hand shot out to steady her, and, for a moment they stood frozen, his fingers wrapped around her arm, their eyes locked. "Thank you," Elena whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. They found Louis sitting in the middle of the old nursery floor, surrounded by wooden blocks and toy soldiers that had belonged to his father 25 years earlier. He looked up when they entered, his face bright with excitement rather than concern. "Mama! Look what I found! Papa's old castle!" Elena sank to her knees beside her son, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "Louis, you scared us terribly. You can't just leave your lessons without telling anyone where you're going." Louis's face fell as he realized he was in trouble. "But Mrs. Whitmore said she'd be right back, and I remembered about Papa's toys. I wanted to see the castle again." Elena closed her eyes, holding her son close and breathing in his familiar scent. When she opened them again, she found Commander Rothwell watching them with an expression that made her heart race. "Perhaps," James said quietly, "we should escort Prince Louis back to his lesson." As they made their way through the corridors, Louis chattering happily about his adventure, Elena noticed that palace staff members were watching them with unusual interest. Word of the search had spread quickly, and she realized that by tomorrow, rumors about Louis's disappearance would be circulating throughout the court. When they reached the breakfast room, they found Mrs. Whitmore waiting with obvious relief and apologies. But they also found Queen Mother Isabel, who had apparently been waiting for their return. "Louis!" Isabel exclaimed, moving toward the boy with outstretched arms. "Thank goodness you're safe." Elena instinctively stepped closer to her son, and she noticed that Commander Rothwell did the same. The subtle movement positioned both adults between Louis and Isabel, creating a protective barrier that couldn't have been coincidental. "Grandmother Isabel," Louis said politely but without enthusiasm. "I was exploring Papa's old nursery." "Were you indeed?" Isabel's smile was warm, but her eyes were calculating. "How adventurous of you. But you gave us all quite a fright, running off like that." Elena felt her temper flare at the implication that Louis had been reckless or irresponsible. Louis wasn't running off. He was exploring, which is perfectly normal behavior for a curious child. Of course, Isabel agreed smoothly. But perhaps this incident demonstrates the need for more structured supervision. More formal protocols. There it was, the conversation they'd been having before Louis disappeared, packaged as concern but really about control. "I think," Commander Rothwell said quietly, "that what this incident demonstrates is the need for clear communication about the prince's whereabouts at all times. I'll be implementing new security protocols to ensure this doesn't happen again." Elena shot him a grateful look. Once again, James had found a way to support her position without directly challenging Isabel's authority. But Isabel was not so easily deflected. "Security protocols are certainly important, Commander. But I was thinking more along the lines of educational structure. Perhaps it's time for Louis to begin his formal training with Professor Hartwell on a daily basis." "That's not necessary," Elena said firmly. "Louis's current education plan is working perfectly well." "Is it?" Isabel's voice carried a subtle challenge. "Because from my perspective, a child who wanders off during lessons might benefit from more rigorous discipline and structure." Elena felt the trap closing around her. By framing her concern as being about Louis's education and safety, Isabel was making it difficult for Elena to object without appearing negligent. "Perhaps," James said carefully, "any changes to Prince Louis's routine should be discussed when Prince Alexander returns. As his father, he should be involved in such decisions." It was another skillful intervention, but Elena could see from Isabel's expression that the Queen Mother was growing tired of the commander's interference in family matters. "Of course Alexander should be consulted," Isabel agreed. "But, as the Queen Mother, I also have certain responsibilities toward the prince's upbringing. responsibilities that I intend to fulfill." The threat in her words was unmistakable. Elena realized that today's events had been a turning point. Isabel was no longer content to make subtle suggestions about Louis's education. She was preparing to assert her authority more directly. "Mama," Louis said quietly, tugging on Elena's dress, "can I finish my castle now?" Elena looked down at her son, his innocent question a stark reminder of what was really at stake in this battle of wills. Louis deserved to be a child, to play and explore and learn at his own pace. But he also deserved protection from the political machinations that surrounded him. "Yes, darling," Elena said, stroking his hair. "You can play for a few more minutes, and then we'll continue your lessons." As Louis settled back at his small table with his blocks, Elena caught Commander Rothwell's eye. There was something in his expression that told her he understood exactly what had just transpired, and that he was prepared to help her face whatever came next. But even as Elena felt grateful for his support, she also recognized the danger in their growing alliance. If Isabel suspected that the commander was taking sides in their conflict, it could make things much worse for everyone involved. The morning's events had changed the dynamics within the palace in ways that Elena was only beginning to understand. But one thing was clear: the battle for Louis's future had only just begun. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the palace windows as Elena made her way to Alexander's private study. After the morning's confrontation with Isabel and Louis's disappearance, she needed to speak with her husband about the escalating situation. But when she reached his study, she found the door slightly ajar and voices coming from within. "Cannot allow this to continue, Alexander." Isabel's voice carried clearly through the gap. "The boy needs proper guidance, and, frankly, I'm not certain Elena is providing it." Elena froze in the corridor, her hand halfway to the door handle. Eavesdropping was beneath her dignity, but the mention of her name and Louis made her pause. "Isabel, we've discussed this." Alexander's voice sounded tired and strained. "Elena is an excellent mother. Louis is happy and healthy." "Happy, perhaps, but is he prepared for his future? This morning's incident proves my point. A properly supervised prince doesn't simply wander off during lessons." Elena's cheeks burned with indignation. She had hoped that Isabel would drop her campaign after Louis had been found safely, but, clearly, the Queen Mother was using the incident to press her advantage. "One instance of childhood curiosity doesn't constitute a pattern of poor supervision," Alexander replied, but Elena detected uncertainty in his voice. "Doesn't it? Consider the broader picture, Alexander." Elena's resistance to formal protocol training, her insistence on treating Louis like an ordinary child, her reliance on inappropriate sources of support. Elena's blood ran cold at those last words. What did Isabel mean by inappropriate sources of support? "What are you implying?" Alexander asked, and Elena could hear the dangerous edge in his voice. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Have you noticed how often Commander Rothwell inserts himself into family matters? How he consistently supports Elena's position in disputes? It's highly irregular." Elena's heart began to race. If Isabel was suggesting what Elena thought she was suggesting, this conversation had just become far more dangerous than a simple disagreement about Louis's education. "James is doing his job," Alexander said firmly. "His responsibility is to ensure the safety and security of our family." "Is it?" "Because from my observations, his attention seems rather focused on Elena specifically." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. If Alexander began to doubt Commander Rothwell's motivations, or worse, Elena's own conduct, the consequences would be catastrophic. "Isabel," Alexander's voice was very quiet now, which Elena knew was a dangerous sign. "I hope you're not suggesting anything improper about my wife's behavior." "Of course not, dear. I'm simply concerned about appearances. The court notices things, you know. Whispers have a way of becoming rumors, and rumors can damage reputations." Elena felt sick. Isabel wasn't just attacking her authority over Louis anymore, she was threatening Elena's reputation and marriage. The Queen Mother was playing a much deeper game than Elena had realized.
What exactly are you proposing? Alexander asked. Several things. First, Professor Hartwell should take over Lewis's primary education immediately. Second, the palace security arrangements should be reviewed to ensure proper professional boundaries. And, third, I think it's time we discussed the possibility of sending Lewis to boarding school. Elena had to bite her lip to keep from gasping aloud. Boarding school? Lewis was only 5 years old. Absolutely not, Alexander's voice was sharp. Lewis is too young for boarding school, and Elena would never agree to it. Elena's agreement may not be the deciding factor, Isabel said smoothly. As king, you have the final authority over the prince's upbringing. And, as queen mother, I have certain traditional rights regarding the education of royal children. The threat was now completely in the open. Isabel was preparing to challenge Elena's maternal authority directly, using the formal structures of the monarchy to override her wishes. Elena had heard enough. She couldn't confront Isabel and Alexander now, not when she had gained this knowledge through eavesdropping, but she needed to find Commander Rothwell immediately. If Isabel was planning to have him removed or transferred, he deserved to know. She made her way quietly down the corridor, her mind racing. The palace suddenly felt like a battlefield where every ally was precious and every conversation was fraught with danger. By the time she reached the security office, her hands were shaking. Commander Rothwell looked up from his desk when she entered, and immediately stood at attention. Your Highness. Is everything all right? Elena glanced around the office, noting that his aide was present. Commander, might I have a private word with you? About the security protocols you mentioned earlier. James dismissed his aide with a nod, then closed the door behind him. As soon as they were alone, his professional demeanor softened slightly. What's wrong? He asked quietly. You look upset. Elena struggled to find the right words. How could she explain what she had overheard without admitting to eavesdropping? How could she warn him about Isabel's suspicions without revealing her own conflicted feelings about their growing closeness? I'm concerned about Queen Mother Isabel's intentions regarding Lewis, she said finally. I think she's planning something more dramatic than just changing his tutoring schedule. James studied her face carefully. What kind of something? She's been questioning my authority as Lewis's mother. She's suggesting that I'm not providing proper supervision or guidance. Elena paused, then forced herself to continue. And I think she may have concerns about your involvement in family matters. Understanding dawned in James's dark eyes. I see. She thinks I'm overstepping my bounds. She thinks. Elena stopped, unable to voice Isabel's actual suspicions. She thinks there's something inappropriate about my support for your position, James finished quietly. Elena nodded, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I never meant for your professionalism to be questioned because of me. Your Highness, James said firmly, you have nothing to apologize for. I've acted according to my judgment about what's best for the royal family's security and stability. If Queen Mother Isabel interprets that as something else, that's her choice. There was something in his voice, a hint of steel beneath the diplomatic words, that told Elena there was more to his statement than simple professional duty. James, she said softly, using his first name for the first time in months. What are we doing here? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, and Elena saw something raw and honest in his expression. I'm trying to protect you, he said quietly. Both of you. Lewis deserves to be raised by his mother, not turned into a political pawn. And you deserve to have someone in your corner when the palace politics get vicious. But that's not your job, Elena whispered. Maybe not. But it's what I'm going to do anyway. The intensity in his voice made Elena's heart race. She realized they were standing closer together than propriety dictated, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. The spell was broken by a sharp knock on the door. They stepped apart quickly as James called, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Lady Margaret, who looked flustered and anxious. Your Highness, I've been looking everywhere for you. Prince Alexander is asking for you in his study. He says it's urgent. Elena's stomach dropped. Had Alexander seen her in the corridor outside his study? Did he know she had overheard his conversation with Isabel? Thank you, Lady Margaret. I'll go to him immediately. As Elena turned to leave, James spoke quietly behind her. Your Highness. Whatever happens, remember that some battles are worth fighting. When Elena reached Alexander's study, she found him pacing by the window, his face dark with frustration. He looked up when she entered, and she searched his expression for any sign that he suspected her of eavesdropping. Elena, thank God. We need to talk. She took a seat in one of the leather chairs near his desk, trying to project calm confidence. What's wrong? Alexander ran his hands through his hair, destroying his usually perfect appearance. Isabel has been making some very serious accusations about Louis's upbringing. About your judgment as his mother. Elena felt relief flood through her. He was telling her about the conversation rather than confronting her about overhearing it. What kind of accusations? She thinks you're being too permissive, too casual about protocol and tradition. She's suggesting that Louis needs more formal education, more structured supervision. Alexander paused, then continued reluctantly. She's even mentioned boarding school. Elena couldn't hide her shock. Boarding school? Alexander, he's 5 years old. I know. I told her absolutely not. But, Elena, she's not going to let this go. She's questioning your authority as Louis's mother, and she has the backing of tradition and protocol. Elena felt the walls closing in around her. What are you saying? Alexander stopped pacing and looked directly at her. I'm saying that we need to be very careful about how we handle this. Isabel has influence with the Privy Council, and if she decides to make this a formal matter, she wouldn't dare. Wouldn't she? Elena, you have to understand, the monarchy operates on precedent and tradition. If Isabel can make a compelling case that Louis's current upbringing is inadequate, she might be able to force changes. Elena felt panic rising in her chest. What kind of changes? Formal tutoring instead of the current arrangement. Strict protocol training. Limited contact with outside influences. Alexander's voice dropped. She's also raised concerns about Commander Rothwell's involvement in family matters. There it was, the threat that Elena had been dreading. What about Commander Rothwell? She thinks he's overstepping his authority, inserting himself into situations that should be handled by family members or tutors. Alexander studied Elena's face carefully. She's not wrong about that, you know. James has been unusually involved in issues related to Louis. Elena felt as though she were walking through a minefield. One wrong word could destroy not only her relationship with Alexander but also James's career and Louis's future. Commander Rothwell has been very professional, she said carefully. If he's been involved in family matters, it's because he's concerned about Louis's security and well-being. Is that all it is? Alexander's question was quiet but direct. Elena met his eyes steadily. Of course. What else would it be? For a long moment, Alexander studied her face, and Elena forced herself to remain calm under his scrutiny. Finally, he nodded. I thought so. But, Elena, we need to be realistic about the situation. Isabel is looking for any excuse to challenge your authority over Louis, and if she can point to irregularities or improper relationships. There are no improper relationships, Elena said firmly. I know that. But, appearances matter in the palace. Perception can become reality very quickly. Alexander moved to sit across from her, reaching out to take her hands. I'm going to support you in this, Elena. Louis belongs with his mother, and I won't let Isabel or anyone else change that. But, we need to be smart about how we fight this battle. Elena squeezed his hands, feeling grateful for his support even as her heart ached with the knowledge of her conflicted feelings about Commander Rothwell. What do you suggest? We make some concessions on the smaller issues to protect the larger ones.
We agree to more formal protocol training for Lewis, but with tutors we approve of, not just Professor Hartwell.
We establish clearer boundaries for palace staff involvement in family matters.
And we present a united front against any suggestion of boarding school.
Elena nodded, recognizing the political wisdom in his approach even as she felt the net tightening around her.
There's one more thing, Alexander said quietly. I think we should consider transferring Commander Rothwell to a different position within the palace security structure. Not a demotion, but a lateral move that would remove him from direct involvement with Lewis. Elena felt as though she had been punched in the stomach.
Is that really necessary? It might be the only way to remove Isabel's ammunition against him. And against you.
Elena realized that this was the price of protecting Lewis and preserving her marriage, sacrificing the one person who had truly supported her through the recent battles with Isabel.
I understand, she said quietly.
But, even as she agreed to Alexander's plan, Elena knew that the fight for Lewis's future was far from over. Isabel had shown her hand, and the Queen Mother's ambitions went far beyond simple changes to Lewis's education. She wanted control of Lewis, of Elena, and, ultimately, of the future succession itself. As Elena left Alexander's study, she realized that she was about to face the most difficult choice of her life, protecting her son's future while sacrificing her own happiness and the man who had become her strongest ally. 2 days later, Elena found herself standing in the palace council chamber, facing a tribunal that would decide the future of her son's upbringing. The formal hearing had been Isabel's idea, presented as a way to resolve the current uncertainties about Prince Louis's education in a manner befitting royal tradition. The chamber itself was imposing, with its dark oak paneling and portraits of long-dead monarchs gazing down from the walls. A long table dominated the center of the room, where 5 members of the Privy Council sat in judgment. At the head of the table sat Lord Chancellor Pemberton, a man in his 70s whose loyalty to tradition was absolute. To his right was Lady Catherine Ashford, the only woman on the council and someone Elena had hoped might be sympathetic to her position. The other 3 council members were elderly men whose names Elena knew but whose personalities remained mysteries to her. Alexander sat at Elena's side, his presence both supportive and tense. Across the table, Queen Mother Isabel was positioned like a prosecutor, her silver hair perfectly arranged and her navy dress chosen to convey authority and gravitas. Behind her sat Professor Hartwell, the stern tutor who would become Lewis's primary educator if Isabel's petition was granted. Your Royal Highness, Lord Chancellor Pemberton began, addressing Elena formally, Queen Mother Isabel has petitioned this council to review the current educational arrangements for Prince Louis. She has expressed concerns about the informal nature of his current instruction and has proposed a more structured approach that would better prepare him for his future role. Elena had spent hours with Alexander and their legal advisor preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on her. I understand the Queen Mother's concerns, Elena replied carefully, but I believe Prince Louis's current education is both appropriate for his age and effective in his development.
With respect, Your Highness, Isabel interjected smoothly, the evidence suggests otherwise.
The recent incident where the prince wandered away from his supervised lesson demonstrates a lack of proper discipline and structure. Elena felt her temper flare but forced herself to remain calm.
Prince Louis displayed normal childhood curiosity.
He was never in any real danger, and the incident lasted less than 30 minutes.
30 minutes during which the heir to the throne was unsupervised and unaccounted for, Isabel pressed. This is precisely the kind of incident that proper formal education would prevent. Lady Catherine leaned forward. Queen Mother Isabel, what specific changes are you proposing? Isabel's smile was triumphant.
Prince Louis should begin immediate formal instruction with Professor Hartwell for 6 hours daily, covering classical languages, mathematics, history, and royal protocol. His current informal play-based learning should be eliminated in favor of structured lessons appropriate to his station.
Elena stood up, unable to remain silent. 6 hours of formal instruction for a 5-year-old child? That's completely inappropriate for his developmental stage.
Your Highness, Lord Chancellor Pemberton said sternly, you will address your remarks to the council, not engage in debate with Queen Mother Isabel.
Elena took a deep breath and turned to face the council members.
My lords and lady, Prince Louis is an intelligent and curious child who is thriving under his current educational program. He's already reading at a level advanced for his age, he demonstrates strong mathematical reasoning, and he has an excellent understanding of history appropriate to his years. Forcing him into an adult-style classroom environment would stifle his natural development and potentially create negative associations with learning.
Nevertheless, one of the elder counselors said, tradition dictates that royal children receive formal instruction from qualified tutors.
The informal methods you describe may be fashionable in modern educational circles, but they lack the rigor required for future monarchs.
Elena felt the discussion slipping away from her.
The council members were nodding along with points about tradition and protocol, seemingly deaf to arguments about child development and individual needs.
Alexander finally spoke. If I may, Lord Chancellor, I'd like to propose a compromise. We could implement more formal instruction for Prince Louis while maintaining some of the flexible elements that have been so successful. Perhaps 3 hours of formal tutoring daily, with the remainder of his education continuing in its current form.
Elena shot him a grateful look, but Isabel was shaking her head.
I'm afraid half measures won't suffice, Alexander. The boy needs complete structure, complete consistency. And, frankly, the current arrangements have created some very concerning irregularities in palace protocol. Lord Chancellor Pemberton raised an eyebrow. What irregularities? Elena's heart sank as she realized what was coming next.
The involvement of security personnel in educational and family matters, Isabel said smoothly.
Commander Rothwell has consistently overstepped his authority, inserting himself into decisions about Prince Louis's upbringing. This represents a dangerous blurring of boundaries between military and civilian authority within the royal household.
That's completely unfair, Elena protested.
Commander Rothwell has acted professionally throughout, has he? Isabel interrupted.
Because I have witnesses who can attest to his unusual level of personal involvement in matters that should concern only the family. Elena realized with growing horror that Isabel had been building a case against James for months, documenting every instance where he had supported Elena's position or protected Louis's interests. Lady Catherine looked troubled.
Queen Mother Isabel, are you suggesting impropriety on the part of Commander Rothwell? I'm suggesting that the current informal arrangements have led to confusion about roles and responsibilities. In a properly structured household, military personnel would not be making decisions about royal education.
Elena wanted to argue that James had never made decisions about Louis's education, but she realized that technically, his support for her positions could be interpreted that way.
Alexander leaned forward. Commander Rothwell is one of our most trusted and professional officers. His involvement in family security matters has always been appropriate.
Perhaps, Isabel conceded, but the appearance of impropriety is almost as damaging as impropriety itself.
If we're restructuring Prince Louis's education, we should also clarify the boundaries of palace staff involvement. Elena saw the trap closing.
Isabel wasn't just trying to control Louis's education, she was systematically removing everyone who had supported Elena's authority as a mother.
Lord Chancellor Pemberton consulted his notes.
Queen Mother Isabel, you've also mentioned concerns about Prince Louis's potential future education.
Would you elaborate on that? Elena's blood ran cold. Here it came, the boarding school proposal.
While immediate changes to his daily instruction are necessary, Isabel said carefully, we should also consider the prince's long-term educational needs. Many of Europe's finest royal families send their heirs to prestigious boarding institutions where they can receive the specialized instruction and character development that royal life demands.
He's 5 years old.
Elena burst out, unable to contain herself any longer. Your Highness, Lord Chancellor Pemberton warned, you will maintain proper decorum. Elena forced herself to sit down, but her hands were shaking with rage and fear.
The idea of sending Louis away from home, away from her protection, was unbearable.
Alexander's voice was tight with controlled anger. I think we're getting far ahead of ourselves discussing boarding school for a child who isn't even 6 years old.
Of course, Isabel agreed smoothly.
I'm simply suggesting that we should have a long-term educational plan in place.
Decisions about the prince's education shouldn't be made on an ad hoc basis.
Lady Catherine had been silent for several minutes, but now she spoke up.
Your Highness, she said, addressing Elena, what are your specific objections to the proposed changes?
Elena took a deep breath, knowing that this might be her only real chance to influence the council's decision. My lady, my primary concern is my son's well-being and development. Prince Louis is a bright, curious, happy child who is thriving under his current education. The proposed changes would eliminate everything that makes learning joyful for him and replace it with a rigid system designed for much older children. Yes, he needs to understand his responsibilities as a future king, but he also needs to develop the emotional intelligence, creativity, and empathy that will make him a good king. 6 hours of formal instruction daily for a 5-year-old would be developmentally harmful and educationally counterproductive. She paused, then continued with growing passion. Furthermore, the suggestion that I am somehow unfit to guide my own son's upbringing is deeply troubling. I am his mother, and I know his needs, his personality, and his capabilities better than anyone. The current educational approach was developed in consultation with child development experts and is producing excellent results. To abandon it in favor of outdated methods simply because they're traditional would be a disservice to Louis and to the future of the monarchy. The chamber fell silent when Elena finished speaking. She looked around the table, trying to gauge the council members' reactions to her words. Lady Catherine was nodding thoughtfully, but the elder councillors looked unmoved by her arguments. Lord Chancellor Pemberton was making notes on his papers, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Highness, he said finally. The council will adjourn to consider the evidence and testimony presented today. We will reconvene in 1 hour to announce our decision. As the council members filed out of the chamber, Elena felt Alexander's hand close over hers. Across the table, Isabel was speaking quietly with Professor Hartwell, her expression confident. How do you think it went? Elena whispered to Alexander. I honestly don't know, he replied quietly. Lady Catherine seemed sympathetic, but the others. He trailed off, but Elena understood. The elder councillors were traditionalists who would likely support Isabel's position simply because it represented established royal protocol. During the recess, Elena and Alexander waited in a small antechamber adjacent to the council chamber. Elena couldn't sit still, pacing back and forth while Alexander tried to project calm confidence. Whatever they decide, Alexander said finally, we'll find a way to make it work. Louis will always have us as his parents, regardless of what tutors or protocols we have to accommodate. Elena appreciated his attempt to reassure her, but she knew that if the council sided with Isabel, it would fundamentally change her relationship with her son. Every decision about his upbringing would be subject to review and challenge. Her authority as his mother would be subordinated to the Queen Mother's vision of royal tradition. The antechamber door opened, and Lady Margaret entered with a message. Your Highnesses, the council is ready to reconvene. Elena and Alexander returned to the council chamber to find the 5 members already seated. Lord Chancellor Pemberton looked grave as he prepared to announce their decision. After careful consideration of the testimony and evidence presented, he began, the council has reached the following decisions regarding Prince Louis's education. Elena held her breath, Alexander's hand tight in hers. First, we find that Prince Louis's current educational arrangements, while unconventional, have produced satisfactory academic progress. However, we also find that more formal instruction in royal protocol and classical subjects would be beneficial. Elena felt a flicker of hope. That sounded like a compromise rather than a complete victory for Isabel. Therefore, we order that Prince Louis shall receive formal instruction for 3 hours daily with qualified tutors approved by both his parents and Queen Mother Isabel. The remainder of his educational time may continue in its current format, subject to regular review. Elena almost smiled with relief, but Lord Chancellor Pemberton wasn't finished. Second, regarding the involvement of palace staff in educational matters, we find that clearer boundaries should be established. Security personnel should focus on their primary responsibilities and avoid involvement in educational or family decisions. Elena's heart sank as she realized what this meant for James. Third, we defer the question of Prince Louis's long-term educational placement pending his successful adaptation to the new tutoring schedule. The boarding school issue was postponed, not eliminated.
Elena knew that Isabel would see this as a partial victory that could be built upon.
These orders take effect immediately, Lord Chancellor Pemberton concluded.
This council is dismissed.
As the chamber emptied, Elena realized that while she had avoided the worst possible outcome, the battle for Louis's future was far from over. She had won enough autonomy to protect her son's happiness for now, but Isabel had gained a foothold that could be expanded over time. More immediately, Elena knew she had to find Commander Rothwell and warn him about the council's decision regarding palace staff involvement. Whatever happened between them personally, she owed him that much for everything he had done to support her and Louis. But, as Elena left the council chamber, she also recognized that the cost of protecting her son's future might be higher than she had ever imagined. The palace had become a battlefield where every relationship was a potential weapon and every kindness could be turned into a liability. The crown's shadow was growing longer, and Elena wasn't sure how much more of herself she could sacrifice to keep Louis safe within its darkness.